Hello and welcome back to Everybody's a Critic. Today I have Jessie Gender on the show. Jessie is a popular YouTuber who tends to talk about pop culture through a transgendered lens. And one movie she's actually covered is today's movie, I Saw the TV Glow. Thank you for coming on, Jessie.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here to talk about a movie that I particularly really love. So,
Yes, and I love it too, though I'll be honest,
hmm?
at first I didn't even know when I first saw it that it was a trans metaphor.
Hmm.
At the time when I had watched it, what I had loved about it was that it felt like a great representation of growing up as a millennial in the 90s.
Hmm.
But as someone who's on the autism spectrum
Mm.
themselves,
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I'm on the autism spectrum as well, so yeah, yeah.
yeah, what I had actually related to in that movie is Owen, because even though they don't outright say it, um, it does kind of seem like he might be on the spectrum.
I can easily see that. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, and as someone who grew up as a pop culture obsessed person like Owen, I really sort of related to to the I sort of just related to Owen as someone who's kind of quiet, who's a
Hmm.
little closed off from the world, doesn't exactly know what to do with their life, who's made movies and
Hmm.
TV shows such a part of their identity. It's like
Hmm.
they don't even really understand what the real world is like. So,
Hmm.
or really relate to the outside world.
Hmm.
But, like Owen, you know, there is sort of a part of me that just wants to be normal, that
Hmm.
just wants to follow what everyone else is doing, even though Owen, I don't always know what is normal, know what I'm
Yeah.
doing in the world. And that's kind of what drew me into the movie, being an autistic millennial who's obsessed with pop culture.
Hmm. I
And
mean, yeah. I mean, but that's to me, that's the power of the movie. I mean, there's so many things I could even dive into what you just said, right? Like, I think I did a video on this on my I have a second channel where I kind of talked about this where there was a group of a contingent of some even trans people online who were like, oh, the movie never says the word trans, and I was a bit disappointed in that it never overtly says trans. And my argument actually is I think the very fact that the movie never overtly says trans, like yes, there are things in the movie that are very overtly like trying to point you towards like you can let me put it this way. There are things in the movie that if someone tried to say like this is not a trans movie, like deny that it's a trans movie full and like at all, like some people do with say The Matrix, for example. There are things in this movie that are very clearly saying like no, this is very much from a trans perspective, like the hints of Owen wearing a dress, the trans coded colors of the movie, like the trans flag that sort of permeates the film to a large degree. Yet so you can never deny that like there's a trans perspective and a trans authorship on the film, yet it never overtly says the word trans, and I think that that's to its credit because it allows the movie to have the power that you're articulating, which is that it opens it up to say that what trans people feel, what this movie is trying to express from a trans perspective, is not uh it is not an othering perspective. It's not a specific perspective in the sense that like this is a feeling that so many people in our culture feel. And you're sort of talking about like being a millennial going into pop culture, and the movie gets into that as well, where it's talking about, and the director has talked about this as well, how this is a feeling for a lot of people who have grown up in our generation where we were promised all of these things in society and saying like oh you should get the girl, you should have a house, And we don't really get to have that. We seem to be working ourselves and grinding ourselves down for capitalism or what have you, and we never seem to fully get there. And there's this disaffectedness, there's this a sense of, in Owen's case, to be specific, like a sense of emasculization. He's supposed to be this man and provide for family, and like it seems emasculated, and it's just this constant like erosion of our sense of self in a society that told us to be these things. And you're always feeling like you're not enough, you're not good enough. And it sort of gets at this sense of like identity of like our wanting to live up to these roles and yet never actually fitting it. And then at the same time, us, like with things like the internet or with pop culture, because the director, they're, if you watch their other work, they're kind of very obsessed with the internet as an idea. So, the Buffy the Vampire Slayer show, and I saw the TV Glow, is to a degree like it's representative of pop culture and movies, but it's also talking about the rise of the internet around that time too, and like people finding their identities through these different things. And how we're able to try to start to articulate who we are through these representations, in different places, in different ways we can build identity. I mean, like for me, for example, kind of like I'm trans as well, but I'm also autistic, and I was hyper fixating on things like Star Trek, which is my big fandom. And so I would like hyper identify with characters like Jessie Dax and Deep Space Nine and find myself through them in a very similar way. For Jessie Dax is a alien being who like has a symbiote inside of her that makes her remember past lives, so she may remember male lives or whatever. Some people remember her as a man in like her life before this one. So like there's sort of like a trans metaphor within that one. So it's just a movie basically that it kind of cuts across this disaffection in this sort of post-Reagan world. Like even the fact that this is set in the suburbs and like the decaying suburbs, and you very clearly evoking like the election of Clinton at the beginning of the movie. Like I think the mother says something alluding very directly when they're in the voting machine talking about Clinton. So it's like very much in that place of like, oh, the sort of slow decay of not even like the American dream necessarily, but it is kind of the American dream, but like this sort of promise and who us finding ourselves through other means rather than trying to subserve to this identity. But then someone like Owen not really being able to escape that pressure that is put upon him.
Yes, exactly. I'll be like I'll be honest, like Owen, I still haven't not sure I'm like 100% there yet, or will
Mm-hmm.
ever be 100% like finding my place,
Mm-hmm.
finding, really what I want to do with my life. But there is sort of that pressure sometimes, that, those feelings of, like I'm in my early 30s, like,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm still and like I don't feel like it almost.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, like, it's we're kind of stuck in this sense of, again, the promise that so many of our generation, like my fiance and I were actually having this talk the other day where we're like, for me it's less of a dream for me, but for her, she always wanted to buy a house. Like she wanted to have a house and settle in and like have a place that she called her own. And for both of us, we sort of both realized, for people in our generation, we're decently okay financially wise, but like we never think we're gonna really be able to own a house, or something like that. And it's like, oh, all these things that we were told to be benchmarkers of our success, are not that. And it's also really interesting too in like in a queer way, not even just like trans, in both, let me actually articulate in this way. I usually, when I say the word queer, I try to de-specify it and use queer as sort of like a way to talk about people who are marginalized from society. But for here, I'll even talk about it in just terms of sexuality. Like, I'm a trans woman, my fiance is a trans woman, and like the benchmarkers of success that we were told of like, oh, you're supposed to get married, you're supposed to have 2.5 kids, you're supposed to like, follow these like sort of rules of like a heterosexual, heteronormative culture. Those aren't going to be what we are ever going to get. And that's like a recurring queer experience of like, oh, we have to sort of renegotiate our understanding of time and our understanding of how the time, like linear time works for us. Um because like society tends to say like, oh, your life goes in this linear way. And queer people don't get to get that, and we always have to kind of renegotiate our understanding with the benchmarkers of our life, but also our benchmarkers of our past, which is always what's interesting with this movie in terms of its temporality, because it is a movie talking about linear time and how time sort of speeds up and goes quick when you're sort of living in this sort of like grinding yourself for the machine of society, and so it's talking about like how just that time goes back, but then how he through like this nostalgic lens of the TV show is able to kind of like renegotiate his past a little bit through his time with his friend, and looking back at his history and being like, oh, I see these benchmarkers of who I actually was seeping through, that I now have to kind of incorporate in my story. And to bring it back to what you were saying, is it's this thing of like he's not really ready to escape that linear story that he's been told, of just not being able to negotiate that story into himself, because it is very scary. The metaphor of the movie uses his death, and like he has to kill himself to be able to join the Pink Opaque, this TV show. And in a large way, we talk about like with trans people, for example, like people talk about like, oh, mourning the life that you have, like even family members be like, I remember my family when I came out as trans, my stepmom cried, not because she was upset that I was trans or anything like that, but she was upset at like the life that I wasn't going to get to have, and being like, I know you're going to deal with a lot more hardship. And I'm scared for that. And then it was a very meaningful like mourning of the life that I'm not going to get to have as a result. And Kevin doesn't get to have that either. Sorry, Kevin, I'm talking to you, Kevin. Sorry. Owen doesn't get to have that either. Sorry, just because you identified. Apologies. But Owen doesn't get to have that either. And so he has to like kill himself, and that's a very scary thing. And I think that that's a thing that like a lot of us, like what you were talking about, which is just it's a scary thing to make that leap to understand like these benchmarks are not going to be what we want. And so can we reimagine something new? And I think, even moving beyond the trans aspect of it, even the autistic aspect of it, it's like a thing I think we're negotiating today. Very much so. It's kind of the video that I did this video, the video that I did this movie on my channel, is like this negotiation of, can we create something new? I think we all are kind of looking around right now, and seeing the apparatuses in the United States, at least, and around the world too, kind of failing us even more so than usual. And I think a lot of people are sort of like scared to let go of that, and still sort of like hoping of like the end, like the institutions will right themselves, or these things will work itself out, or we can just fix it. And we're kind of we're scared to imagine a new way of existing, a new way of being, a new way to go for it. And especially because it's hard to articulate it, and like things like movies and TV shows kind of help us articulate that, like imagine new worlds. Um and and so it's just this negotiation of like, do we pursue these things that are scary and create something new or not? It's why I just to you, I know I'm ranting here, and I'll sort of pass back to you, so apologies, but like it's it's why I was interested when you asked me to do this podcast about like saying, oh, it's a disagreement. I think your podcast is kind of based on like people disagreeing with you on the movies. And I don't think I disagree with you on this movie. And I think the power of this film is how it universal, like it uses transness emotionally, because the director's experience, to universalize a feeling I think so many people are feeling in our world right now, are like this disaffected feeling with the status quo, but also the fear of imagining something new and not even really knowing how to articulate it just yet, not having the tools to articulate it, which I think is very fascinating.
Yeah.
Sorry, I ranted a whole bunch at you.
No, 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 no. I think you make actually excellent points. Yeah, which is that, I'll speak from my experience. Like, when I was a kid, I wanted to be like an actor, but like
Hmm.
I saw it more as like being a movie star. Like I would look
Hmm.
up, people who are in like movies and TV shows, and like and like make up projects to be with them in it. And
Hmm.
then like, when when I was in college, I went to a college purchase that, is a performing arts school, but there was this pressure to like get like a normal job. So
Hmm.
I got a psych degree. instead.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And,
Mm-hmm.
looking back, I probably would have gotten like maybe a major, as sort of my life has gone on, I've honestly kind of realized that even after I graduated from college, I did for like a year or two try to become, an actor, went on some auditions and stuff. But I will say that I kind of realized I preferred the more like behind the scenes stuff, but not necessarily like directing, but
Mm-hmm.
more like, sort of producing. But it is sort of like, you know, at the at the end of the day, now I'm kind of trying to get to that level. But
Mm-hmm.
it's like,
Mm-hmm.
I'm sort of at an age where like, in the past, like it seems like you should like there
You
was
should have
that
made it by now.
pressure.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it's the same thing I'm dealing with too. Like I'm lucky enough where I'm at. Like I am doing, my career is decently good. I have a YouTube channel that's doing pretty well overall, and I'm able to direct a few things. But even I have this feeling of like I feel stuck sometimes of like, oh, what am I trying to do? I mean, working in LA right now, I see a lot of my friends who, I have some close friends who have been working in this industry for years, who are even older than I am, and even in recent years, they like started to have their career go forward, and then they have had to step back because just the industry's contracting and pulling back, and now they've had to like take jobs that are, I don't want to say beneath them, but beneath where they have risen in their careers, um, because just there's no jobs for them, and especially since they're usually a lot of them are women of color that I know, and they aren't given those positions, and it's just this again, it's just this contraction of the dreams and the people that are still getting to get those roles. They're like the older generation who are uh like kind of holding on to that power. Like even like we can look at it in politics, but even in like Hollywood, it's like a lot of the people in charge of all these projects that my friends are working on are like people who have been there for years, and there's not anything. They're just kind of regurgitating stories that we've already seen, and, you know, you sort of sit here, like even myself, and being like, I don't necessarily know if my voice is ever going to be heard. I think you and I and a lot of people like us have stories we want to tell, things we want to say, things we want to do, projects we want to work on, whether it be in the arts or whether it be in whatever career you may choose. Um, but we aren't allowed to tell them, and we're sort of like forced to like give our voices to these other projects that don't really feel authentic to ourselves, but it's just what we're kind of forced to do. I mean, I've seen it myself too, where like there's been people that I've worked with that are like, I try to articulate my perspective on a story or a script or whatever, and they're like, no, 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 that makes no sense, or like they don't get it, and then they release a movie and it's like it's fine, it's whatever, it's a perfectly fine story, but it's not anything new or saying anything different and not anything interesting to me or to a lot of people. And I think that's why a lot of like stories fail nowadays, because like, yeah, they're functional but they're not interesting to what people are feeling. And and I think it goes to like what you were saying too about how like, you when you were in college, like you wanted to pursue like going into like filmmaking and creating the career, but then we're sort of pushed into the more conventional narrative of like get a job, get a one that like a job that makes sense. And it's the same thing there too, where it's like you want to pursue something that's interesting and intriguing and take that risk on your voice and yourself, and then you're pushed into being doing something more conventional because it's the story that people know and the story that people understand. And I think again, it's just constantly how we're pressured to do that. And I just wish and I think something like I Saw the TV Glow is a movie that is trying to push people to be like, we can create a world where we have that power to create and imagine. I mean, it's not uncoincidental that the movie is about, or the show that they watch, the Pink Opaque in the movie, is about these two girls who have these like psychic powers to connect with each other and form bonds and be stronger than others. That very Buffy thing of like, oh, in a world where I am seen as not having power, like as a woman or like these marginalized people, I can actually have a lot more strength than I think I do. And I think that's what a lot of people respond to something like Buffy, because it was sort of that subversion of that trope. But it is interesting to me too, kind of even talking myself through it now. It's interesting that the show is not something that's like they're still fighting. Mr. Melancholy in that show. It's like it's a show that's still them fighting these forces, just they have more power and agency to do it as themselves. Instead of it being a show that is like something radically different. It's just the show is trying to get these people to like have the consciousness to be able to like recognize the villain and fight back, and in a way that like feels very much like what we're dealing with today, with a lot of people like trying to build consciousness to fight back against like systems of oppression that we live within, whether it be capitalism, fascism, imperialism, da 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 da. And it's sort of interesting because I sometimes even find it more interesting. Not to say that that's wrong. I mean, that's a very clearly good story to articulate. But I think it's interesting too that we still, even within that story, is not necessarily like there's a radical sense of claiming self, but not necessarily radical sense of like completely rechanging the structure of reality. Like they're changing their reality by changing the consciousness that they enter into, but it's not a complete like this is a new future we're building, which is kind of fascinating in an interesting way now that I kind of think about it. Anyways, I talked myself into a different point, so apologies, Kevin.
No, no, no. No, actually, it leads to sort of an interesting point, which is that, in real life, like with the Pink Opaque, a lot of popular children's young adult media,
Mm-hmm.
uh, are about, children or young people trying to fight back against so oppressive forces.
Mm-hmm. She-Ra, like I can name a whole bunch. It always is that. Like
Avatar, Hunger Games.
Steven Universe, yeah.
Yeah, so and I think there is sort of that appeal of like watching children in a leadership position that I think, tying back to the movie, sort of ties back well into Owen and Maddie's like want to sort of be the
Mm-hmm.
characters from the Pink Opaque. They they see themselves as trapped in this society and trapped it and like they just want this like sense of freedom.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's fascinating too because it's again we are talking about that negotiation of time earlier, right? With like youth and queer people, like we like for trans people, there's like a thing in the trans community that is known that like when you come out as trans and maybe you start HRT or whatever, you kind of have a second puberty. And so there's a sense of like a new childhood that you get. And that's part of like time, this negotiation of time, this I feel it a lot too. It's like, oh man, I wish I could have lived in that timeline where I got to have a childhood as the gender that I saw myself as. But then I also have to like sort of claim like, oh, I have to live my life now in the time that I am now and like renegotiate like, oh, I'm having like a new puberty at a younger age. And so it's just or an older age. And so it's this interesting negotiation of time of like youth and energy. And I think in our society, it's interesting with like youth are are an interesting battleground in terms of how do people conceptualize youth because a lot of our media is, as you say, teaching youth to fight back radically against systems, to just be like, you are young, you are new, you can think of new ways to create this world and sort of escape the mindsets of the world that we live in, while still suffering a lot of the traumas of it, because a lot of those stories are also about like how kids are traumatized. I use She-Ra as a quick example, but like She-Ra was like an agent of the oppressive regime in that show at the start of it. But like a lot of those same things of these kids are traumatized by these systems in some way or shape or form, and you're able to think of something new from it, or sometimes reaffirm it based on their traumas or whatnot, or their raising or whatever. Um, and yet so much of like conservative discussion today is like, oh, protect the youth, you got to save the youth or whatever. Um, and it's usually this negotiation of like, oh, we want kids to kind of grow up in the conventional way, that kind of mirrors our upbringing. Usually people saying these things are like, oh, I want my kid to grow up to be, like me in some way, shape, or form, or the way that I want them, or like fitting into the conventional common sense, quote unquote, common sense way of society, which is always based in like assumptions of what common sense is. Um, and so this, it's like, yeah, that's that interesting negotiation there. And that we see in I Saw the TV Glow, because the show is kind of showing Owen that you can fight back and create something new and claim your identity. And then yet you get his parents, his mom, who is sort of like herself kind of like not really like she's loving and caring, but she's not super active as a presence in terms of like going out and doing things. Whereas his dad is very much trying to reaffirm that masculinity in him. Like, oh, that, and it's not like it's not physically abusive. And even some people wouldn't even necessarily qualify it as an emotionally abusive. I would say it certainly is to a degree, but like it's not like overtly like cruel, but there is a subtle cruelty in that like, oh, you need to be a man. And that's how it sort of like affirms like be like me. Because it's his dad sort of being like saying to be like him. And so there's that interesting negotiation um there between how we conceptualize youth and like do we ask youth to create something new or not? And seeing where Owen sort of falls within that. And there's also an interesting thing too that's not necessarily it's always worth articulating because some people kind of miss it. It was something I was sort of learning about as I was doing, but it also is like if we're talking about his parents, something about like racial aspect of this because the character is Owen is biracial and you know it's living in this suburban area and his mom is sort of like dies early and he sort of doesn't have this connection to you know that side of himself you know because his mom is black and so like he doesn't necessarily have that connection to that culture or history that many black Americans in the United States have but even then also sometimes feel like disillusioned from as well living up in like very white coded suburbs. So it's like again, it's just this constant negotiation of like not being able to understand our history, our culture, our where we're coming from, whether it be queer, whether it be trans, whether it be black, whether it be you know all of these different things. Um, and like how do we find our identity without those tools? And we tend to find it through pop culture. You know, I'm writing something. I'll tell you, I'm working on a book right now and it's a nonfiction book about Star Trek, like a history of Star Trek, and from a queer perspective. And one of the arguments that I'm making in it is like queer people have our history often very much erased from ourselves, like we have our entire history erased. And I grew up not knowing queer history, like you know, look at fascism and the story of like how the Nazis burned the Institute of Sexology, which is where a lot of trans research was, completely burned down. And so there's like a lot of trans history that's just gone. And then throughout history, trans history has been generally erased, queer history has been generally erased. And so I didn't have those tools. And yet I was able to discover that I was trans through Star Trek. And it's like these constant rediscoverings of truth and identity through popular culture, through exploring other modes of being. Um, and so it's sort of like this constant like negotiation of history and time and youth and age and culture and it's all these fascinating things that the show sort of touches upon in really intelligent ways.
Yeah. And you know, going off of that, like there's a lot of like pop culture that, people just grow up on that I think the movie does a good job, at portraying like how, people can sort of draw
Mm-hmm.
upon and relate to, like a piece of pop culture, whether or not that was really the creator's original intent.
Mm-hmm.
Like, just look at, all those think pieces about a Goofy movie and how it's
Mm-hmm.
secretly a movie about living as a young black kid in 90s America. Something
Yeah.
that even the Disney Plus documentary on it talks about.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Sorry, can you say that again? My brain like blanked for a second. The Disney Plus, what was the documentary again?
Not just a goof.
Oh, yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, I mean like there's you just reminded me too. There's an episode of Atlanta. Have you seen the
Yes.
is that did you just mention or
Yes, I've seen that episode.
yeah, where it's an interesting so for the listeners, there's an episode of Atlanta with that where it's a mockumentary, sort of fake documentary where a black man was the one who sort of directed the Goofy movie. And this it's not true. Like it's a fake documentary about a fake history of the Goofy movie, but it's sort of drawing out like how the Goofy movie has a lot of like black codedness to it as well. And it's like a reclaiming of the history of that movie as like a black movie, even though it wasn't meant to be that. And so it's like this it's interesting sort of like reclaiming of things. And it's a thing that we see with like queer media as well, right? Which is queering history. When we queer history, it's to say like, oh, we take this and we claim it now. We claim it for ourselves in a way that um that mainstream culture necessarily wouldn't understand, and is often very aggressive towards, like even something like The Matrix, which is clearly a trans story, right? But like when queer people and trans people try to say, oh, this is a trans and queer film, even when it's very overtly so, there's a hostilities towards it, saying no, this isn't trans. And there's like so many think pieces and things like that from people being like, no, well, The Matrix isn't really a trans movie. Um, and because it's trying to deny our ability to claim these things, because to claim them is to reclaim our history and reclaim it for ourselves. And it's the same thing with like Buffy or The Pink Opaque, which was like this like queer like the show was overtly trying to be like women stepping into these powerful roles, and yet it was done at the time to reaffirm Joss Whedon as a creator, who was sort of given all the accolades as like the male feminist guy. And so the story of the piece, in terms of pop culture, was like Joss Whedon is the cool guy, and you see this in like the ways that Joss Whedon's career took off after that. But then Sarah Michelle Gellar, well, certainly having a career, has not never got to the level of fame of like making Marvel movies that Joss Whedon got to make. And so the acclaim went to the guy, and that sort of became the narrative of like, look at this guy who understood women and could write women really well. And now we're at a point late in history, like given where Joss Whedon has sort of like been exposed as kind of an asshole. Um, it's now we're seeing a push to reboot Buffy the Vampire Slayer with an all-woman team, like Sarah Michelle Gellar is sort of in the executive producer role. I forget the director of I
Chloe
forget
Zhao.
her name. Yes, thank you. Who I really like. I like her work. I'm actually a big fan of The Eternals. I believe she directed The Eternals. I believe that's one
She
she
did.
directed. Yeah, I'm actually a fan of that movie, even though I'm fairly alone in that opinion. But even her work before then as well. And it's like, oh, an all-female team is claiming this. And it's like being like, all right, we claim this thing that has sort of been taken away from us. And I think that that's what queer people do, right? Is we reclaim history and renegotiate the terms by which we tell the story of our history and the terms by which we tell the story of our society and culture. And I think that's sort of what Owen in The Pink Opaque is kind of in negotiation with. Like he's trying so desperately to figure out how to negotiate the story of his life. And he's still, by the end of the movie, still telling the story of his life that is that sort of straight coded story of like the heterosexual culture. Um, but pulling into what you were saying, like, neurotypical culture or, white culture, like all of these things sort of align in different ways. And he's in this negotiation of how do I tell this other story about myself, to the point where like in the beginning of the movie he says he doesn't think he has a heart. And that's the one piece of hope in this movie. Or it's like he says on the bleachers in that one scene, it's like, oh, I know if I cut myself open, there won't be anything inside of me. I'll be dead inside. And that's sort of like this idea that fascism often sells, that like, oh, you human beings are inherently awful. You are terrible people. We are all terrible. We're all sinful people inherently. And as a result of being full of sin, we need to give ourselves to something greater, whether it be God or this is very Catholic like stuff, like very overtly like Roman Catholic-y stuff, but like God or the machine of capitalism, or to the fascistic heterosexual masculine culture, white supremacist culture. Like give yourselves to these things because these are the greater projects because you are sinful. But what queer people try to do and say, and what the movie gets at when Owen at the movie cuts himself open and like sees his heart, is it's saying, no, there's still something alive in you. There's a truth alive in you that you can still follow. And you are told that it's not there and you're told not to see it, but it's still there. And you can choose to follow that. And it's a very beautiful thing, but it means you have to actually choose to do that. So which why I really love that ending, because there's an alternate ending, I believe, where they actually wrote it where the movie ends like on Owen sort of walking through and apologizing to everyone right after opening his heart and seeing that it's there. And in another version of the ending, I think they even filmed walks out of the place that he works and like runs off into the woods or something like that. And it's more overtly hinting at like, oh, okay, he's made the choice to go and like try and join the Pink Opaque. And I actually like where it ends better because it spurns this impetus in the viewer to have that conversation. Because if you end that way, you end the other way, um, it sort of makes it easy on the viewer in the sense that like, oh, there's hope, and I can sort of end the movie being like, and the narrative's complete. But what this movie does by sort of cutting off so abruptly, it sort of has to force you to be like, oh, I wanted him to escape. Why? And you have to think it through, and it challenges you more. And it challenges you to complete the story more rather than the movie completing it for you. And I think that that's what the movie's trying to get at is like we all should be doing that in our own life of negotiating these things, negotiating the stories that we've been told. Um, and I think the most telling thing to me in terms of how people read the movie is if people read the movie and they're like, "Oh, the pink opaque isn't real," or "The pink opaque is real," because I think the movie is very clear. I'm not even thinking even clear. I think the movie very much is on the side of the pink opaque is very real, and he needs to choose it. But it leaves it open to the interpretation that it's not because I think that's what people right now are negotiating is like, are we choosing to follow that path and create something new and like fight to recognize ourselves? Or are we choosing to just sort of reaffirm the status quo that we all would live within?
Yes, and I think that's the perfect place to end it. But thank you again,
Yeah,
Jesse,
thank
for
you.
coming on to the show. Yeah, and uh just Jesse, where can people find you?
Yeah, you can find me at Jessie Gender on YouTube. That's my main YouTube channel where I do video essays and stuff like that. I have a secondary channel called Jessie Gender After Dark where I do reviews of TV shows like Doctor Who and right now Doctor Who, Last of Us, and Star Wars Andor and a few others. I'm a big Star Trek fan, so I review those. I have a podcast called Frack This Podcast where I'm rewatching Battlestar Galactica with my friend Vera Wild, who has never seen it, which is a lot of fun. And then I'm on Nebula, which has my movie Identities, which is the science fiction film. If you like The Matrix or you like horror movies like Cube, it's a science fiction film that stars John Delancey from Star Trek The Next Generation. So check that out on Nebula. And also, I'm directing an episode of a TV series that Nebula is doing called Subliminal that'll be coming out later this year. And then I have a Patreon that helps me pay bills, and then I'm on Blue Sky as well. So those are all the major things.
Hey, well, thanks again, everyone, for watching. Everybody is a critic. Sorry it's been a while. I had a lot of shit to do, but next time we'll be talking about The Godfather with someone who has, let's just say, Peter Griffin's opinion on it.